Any reasonable being would have recognized this as a Xerathi and immediately contacted security, fled the sector and possibly updated their will. The Xerathi Empire didn't just have a reputation for aggressive expansion, they had patents on several different methods of planetary sterilization and a customer service department that handled complaints about their genocide techniques. They were what happened when evolution decided to combine the strategic thinking of chess masters with the casual brutality of natural disasters. Melody, displaying the kind of decision-making that had gotten humans classified as harmlessly curious in the first place, instead found herself wondering if the alien was hungry. This was objectively insane. The Xerathi were professional extinction specialists who treated the concept of mercy as a character flaw to be eliminated through selected breeding. Their military doctrine was built around the principle that any problem could be solved with sufficient application of directed energy weapons and creative intimidation techniques. Their idea of diplomatic negotiation involved showing up with enough firepower to crack moons and asking if anyone had objections to their proposed treaty terms. But Melody had grown up with pets, and wounded animals triggered something in her brain that completely bypassed rational threat assessment. The fact that this particular animal belonged to a species that used comprehensive planetary liquidation as a standard greeting didn't register as particularly relevant to her compassion centers. She started with water. Basic hydration seemed like a safe place to begin, and she had access to the industrial cleaning supplies that included reasonably pure H2O. The Xerathi, though she didn't know his species designation yet, remained unconscious, but his breathing seemed to stabilize slightly after she managed to get some liquid into his system. Food came next. The station's cafeteria disposed of enough leftover protein bars and nutrition supplements to feed a small army, most of it perfectly edible but aesthetically unacceptable to species with refined palates. Melody began smuggling these discards down to the waste processing level, leaving them within reach of her unconscious discovery. The first sign that her patient was recovering came 3 days later, when she arrived for her shift to find the food gone and a pair of golden eyes tracking her movements with the focused intensity of a predator, calculating optimal attack angles. Most beings would have interpreted this as an excellent time to update their emergency contacts and make peace with whatever deities they favored. Melody interpreted it as progress. "Hey there," she said, settling down at what she hoped was a safe distance while unpacking her latest care package. "You're looking better today." The Xerathi made a sound that was probably meant to be threatening but came out more like a question. His name was Xerathi, though Melody wouldn't learn this for several more days. He was a hunter prime of the 3rd Extermination Fleet, genetically enhanced for combat operations and psychologically conditioned to view mercy as evolutionary weakness. The concept of a prey species voluntarily providing aid was so far outside his cultural programming that his brain kept trying to categorize it as some form of elaborate trap. But Melody kept returning, night after night, with food and water and increasingly creative medical supplies lifted from the station's first aid stations. She chatted at him in her incomprehensible language while cleaning his wounds, with the careful attention of someone who actually cared whether he lived or died. It was the most surreal medical treatment in recorded galactic history. Their communication evolved through necessity and stubborn determination. Melody would point to objects and repeat their names. Xerathi would respond with sounds that gradually became recognizable as attempts at human words. She taught him food, water, and better. He taught her the Xerathi concepts for pain, healing, and eventually pack bond, a term that carried implications he wasn't entirely sure he understood yet. The breakthrough came during week 4 of their unauthorized medical partnership. Melody had been explaining her daily cleaning routine, partly to practice communication, partly because talking helped her organize her thoughts, when Xerathi interrupted with a carefully pronounced question. "Why help, Xerathi?" The question hung in the recycled air between them. It was the first complete sentence he'd managed in her language, and it carried the weight of genuine confusion. In Xerathi culture, aid was transactional. You helped allies because they helped you. You spared enemies because they had strategic value. You showed mercy because it served tactical purposes. The idea of helping someone simply because they needed help was so alien that their language barely had words for it. "Because you were hurt," Melody replied, as if this explained everything. To her, it did. To Sarcastic, it was like discovering that gravity worked backwards on Tuesdays. His entire worldview had been built around the principle that the universe was divided into us and obstacles to our expansion. The concept that a member of an inferior species would risk punishment to aid a member of a superior one without expecting anything in return was revolutionizing his understanding of existence. Station Administrator Vexstar, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware that his facility's waste management had become ground zero for the most significant interspecies contact event in recent galactic history. His reports to the Trade Commission continued to emphasize the station's efficiency and safety record, completely missing that one of his human janitors was conducting unauthorized diplomatic relations with a member of the galaxy's most feared military organization. This cosmic comedy of errors continued for 6 peaceful weeks until the universe decided it was time for the punchline. The discovery came during a routine security sweep. Junior Security Officer Kelton, following up on reports of unusual energy signatures in the lower levels, stumbled upon what appeared to be a scene from a xenobiologist's worst fever dream. A human sharing what looked suspiciously like lunch with a fully recovered Xerathi Hunter Prime. The panic that followed registered on seismic equipment 3 levels up. Emergency protocols activated with the efficiency of a well-oiled doomsday machine. Every available expert on xenobiological toxins was dragged from their sleep to analyze the situation. The consensus was swift and uniformly terrifying. Their human had been compromised by xenobiological mind control technology, infected with submission programming, or possibly just driven insane by prolonged exposure to xenobiological toxins. Administrator Vexstar, his normally steady demeanor cracking under the pressure of managing an unprecedented crisis, made the decision that would reshape interstellar politics for the next century. To prevent the spread of whatever alien influence had compromised their human worker, Melody Chen would need to be eliminated, for the greater good. The safety of civilized space demanded such sacrifices. The irony of this decision would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for generations. In their attempt to prevent contamination, they were about to create the exact scenario they most feared. What they failed to consider, and really this oversight deserved its own chapter in military intelligence textbooks, was that Sarcastic had been listening to their communications. 6 weeks of recovery had restored not just his health but his linguistic processing abilities, and he'd learned enough of the station's trade language to understand exactly what these civilized beings planned to do to his packmate. The word packmate in Xerathi culture carried implications that most species couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just friendship or alliance. It was a fundamental redesignation of tribal boundaries that made the other being family in the most literal, protective sense possible. Harm to pack was harm to self. Threats to pack required total response. And these soft, bureaucratic creatures were planning to murder his. Sarcastic's recovery had been more complete than anyone realized. Weeks of careful nursing had restored not just his strength, but his full combat capabilities, including access to the biotechnological enhancements that made Xerathi hunters the stuff of galactic nightmares. When he emerged from the lower levels like vengeance given form and fury, the station's security systems didn't just fail, they actively apologized for the inconvenience. The carnage was brief, efficient, and thoroughly educational for any surviving witnesses about the difference between contained threat and very angry Xerathi with family to protect. Administrator Vexstar's last coherent thought was probably wondering how their risk assessment protocols had failed so spectacularly. But Sarcastic wasn't finished. Couldn't be finished. Because in Xerathi culture, threats to pack weren't resolved through individual action. They were answered by the entire tribal structure, and his tribal structure happened to include the 3rd Extermination Fleet, approximately 12,000 warriors with access to weapons that violated several laws of physics, and War Matriarch Velkara, his commanding officer, and a being whose idea of proportional response had once involved sterilizing an entire star system because someone had been rude during trade negotiations. The distress beacon he transmitted didn't just call for backup, it declared blood debt against anyone who had threatened Pac. It announced that the Xerathi Empire was officially taking this personally. The first ships arrived within hours. Sleek vessels that moved through space like predatory shadows, their hulls inscribed with kill tallies that read like astronomical measurements. Then came the heavy cruisers, mobile fortresses designed for orbital bombardment and aggressive urban renewal projects. Finally, the War Matriarch's flagship, a vessel so heavily armed that its weapon systems had their own weapon systems. War Matriarch Velkara's response to the situation was characteristically direct. Her opening communication to the Universal Trade Commission consisted of exactly 17 words. "You attempted to murder a being under Xerathi protection. Choose your method of death efficiently." The Trade Commission's response was swift and predictably inadequate. Diplomatic channels opened, mediators deployed, peace offerings prepared, all standard protocols for dealing with interstellar incidents involving wounded pride and territorial disputes. What they weren't prepared for was Velkara's clarification. This wasn't about territory or trade disputes or any of the usual causes of interstellar conflict. This was about family, pack bonds, and the fundamental principle that threats to Xerathi packmates required comprehensive response, regardless of the strategic cost-benefit analysis. The concept was so foreign to civilized diplomatic discourse that the universal translators initially categorized it as religious mysticism. When the meaning finally penetrated, the Trade Commission faced an unprecedented crisis. A major galactic power was willing to commit systematic genocide over what amounted to an employment dispute involving one human janitor. Attempts at negotiation revealed the full scope of the problem. Sarcastic had bonded with Melody according to cultural protocols that treated packmates as extensions of tribal identity. She wasn't just his friend, she was literally family now. Protected by honor codes that had guided Xerathi expansion for millennia, the Commission tried reason. She's just one human. Surely this can be resolved diplomatically. The Xerathi response came in the form of the Kepler 442 system, mysteriously developing a new asteroid field, where 3 inhabited planets used to orbit. They tried bargaining. "We'll provide compensation, territory, preferential trade status." The Xerathi response was a polite inquiry about whether the Commission had any final messages they'd like preserved for historical records. They tried threats. "If you continue this aggression, we'll mobilize the combined fleet." The Xerathi's response was the sound of an entire war council laughing until they had trouble breathing, followed by tactical demonstrations of why their military technology was generally considered physically unfair. Meanwhile, Melody found herself at the center of the most surreal protection detail in galactic history. Sarcastic had appointed himself her permanent guardian, which, in Xerathi terms, meant she now traveled with an escort capable of sterilizing solar systems if someone looked at her wrong. Her new living situation aboard Velkara's flagship was a study in cultural contradictions. She had luxury quarters that were bigger than her old apartment, attended by warriors who could punch through starship hulls, but who served her tea with the delicate precision of ceremonial artists. She was simultaneously the most honored guest and the most strategically valuable being in known space. One paper cut could potentially trigger intergalactic warfare. The absurdity reached its peak during what military historians would later call the snack food incident. Melody mentioned missing Earth chocolate, a casual comment that Sarcastic interpreted as a nutritional emergency requiring immediate tactical response. Within 6 hours, a Xerathi strike force had liberated an entire agricultural world to establish proper cocoa production facilities. The fact that this world had been inhabited by a peaceful farming community was considered a minor operational detail. The Commission's surrender, when it finally came, was less dramatic than expected, but more comprehensive than anyone had dared hope. Faced with the choice between maintaining their current employment practices and maintaining their existence as a functional government, they chose survival with remarkable efficiency. The Treaty of Nexus Station established new protocols for human treatment throughout Commission space. No more exploitative labor contracts, no more treating an entire species as expendable workforce. No more casual dismissal of human safety concerns. Humans were reclassified from Category 12, harmless curiosities, to Category 1 beings, under Xerathi tribal protection. The treaty's enforcement mechanism was elegantly simple. Every human in Commission space was now under the implicit protection of the Xerathi Empire. Harm 1, answer to 12,000 professional extinction specialists with a cultural obligation to take these things personally. Melody, meanwhile, had achieved something unique in galactic history. She'd become a human with the kind of protection usually reserved for strategic resources under interstellar law. Her daily routine now included security briefings from Xerathi intelligence about potential threats to her welfare, which seemed to encompass everything from minor mechanical malfunctions to unfavorable weather patterns. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd gone from being ignored as an expendable worker to being protected as a strategic asset. The Commission had treated humans as disposable for so long that they'd forgotten they were dealing with actual sentient beings, capable of forming genuine relationships with species far more dangerous than themselves. She often wondered, during quiet moments aboard Velkara's ship, whether this was how revolutions were supposed to start. She'd begun by trying to help one injured alien and ended up with the galaxy's most effective military force as her extended family. The universe's sense of humor, she reflected, was both comprehensive and remarkably thorough. The final cosmic punchline came months later, when xenosociologists studying the crisis reached a conclusion that fundamentally altered humanity's position in the galactic community. Humans, they determined, possessed something that more advanced species had systematically eliminated from their cultures in favor of efficiency and logical resource allocation: the ability to form genuine emotional bonds with beings completely unlike themselves. This wasn't strategy or survival instinct or any of the calculated behaviors typically associated with diplomatic relations. This was something far more dangerous: authentic compassion that functioned regardless of species, threat assessment, or political considerations. Humans could look at a wounded member of the galaxy's most feared military organization and see not a strategic opportunity or a dangerous liability, but simply another being who needed help. And when you saved the life of a creature genetically engineered for warfare and conquest, you didn't just gain an ally, you gained a family member with the technological capacity to rearrange star charts and the cultural programming to consider this a perfectly reasonable response to threats against PAC. The Commission had spent decades cataloging human physical capabilities, social structures, and technological development, missing the most important factor. Humans were dangerous not because of what they could do, but because of who they could convince to do it for them. Melody looked out at the stars streaming past her viewport and smiled. Somewhere out there, her species was living safer lives because she'd shared her lunch with a wounded alien. The galaxy was more peaceful because she'd treated a dying predator with the same kindness she'd show an injured stray cat. The universe had taught the galaxy's advanced civilizations a lesson about the true nature of strength. Real power wasn't about who could destroy worlds. It was about who could inspire world destroyers to become protectors. And in that particular metric, humanity had just discovered they were absolutely terrifying. The Universal Trade Commission had perfected the art of bureaucratic species classification with the same enthusiasm most civilizations reserved for tax collection, which is to say, with mind-numbing thoroughness and a complete disconnect from reality. Their official taxonomy divided all sentient life into 47 distinct categories, ranging from transcendent intellectual entities at the top to barely conscious rock formations at the bottom. Humans, through what could only be described as cosmic bureaucratic comedy, had been classified as Category 12, harmless curiosities with aggressive tendencies. This designation meant that humanity was considered just intelligent enough to operate basic machinery, just docile enough to not pose a real threat, and just expendable enough to handle all the jobs that more advanced species found beneath their dignity. It was a classification that had served the galaxy remarkably well for the past 2 centuries, assuming your definition of remarkably well included widespread exploitation disguised as economic opportunity. Nexus Station exemplified this arrangement perfectly. A sprawling commercial hub floating in the neutral zone between 3 major galactic powers, it processed roughly 60% of all interstellar trade while maintaining the aesthetic charm of a particularly ambitious oil rig. The station's upper levels housed the offices of important beings, making important decisions about important things. The middle levels contained the shops, restaurants, and entertainment districts where those important beings spent their important money. And the lower levels, well, the lower levels were where humans worked. Melody Chen had been scrubbing the industrial sectors of Nexus Station for 3 years, which made her something of a veteran in an occupation with a notably high turnover rate. Not because the work was particularly dangerous, though it was, but because most humans eventually saved enough credit to buy passage elsewhere, anywhere that didn't involve cleaning up after species that considered basic sanitation beneath their evolutionary status. She'd taken the job fresh out of technical college, with dreams of working her way up to actual engineering positions. 3 years later, she'd developed a philosophical appreciation for the absurdity of her situation, and an encyclopedic knowledge of which alien species produce the most inexplicable waste products. The Zephyrians, for instance, apparently considered leaving behind crystalline formations that hummed ominously to be perfectly normal bathroom etiquette. The night shift suited her perfectly. Fewer supervisors meant fewer opportunities for casual species-based condescension, and the industrial levels during off-world experiments had a peaceful quality that almost made up for the constant background radiation and occasional structural groaning that suggested the station's engineers had optimistic views about load-bearing capacity. It was during one of these peaceful midnight cleaning sessions that Melody discovered someone had dumped what appeared to be a very large, very dead alien in the waste processing sector. Her first instinct was to file a maintenance request and let someone else deal with it. Her second instinct was to take a closer look, because 3 years of janitorial work had given her a professional curiosity about unusual messes. The alien in question was definitely not dead, despite initial appearances. It was, however, making a remarkably good impression of something that wished it were. 8 feet of chitinous armor and predatory muscle mass lay crumpled among discarded packaging materials and industrial sludge, leaking various fluids that probably violated several environmental safety protocols.